Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alan Jordan, Regional Business Development Director at Nucleus. Thanks for those who are returning for our third week of Illuminate Live Focus, and a big welcome for you, those that join us for the first time. This week, we're delighted to be joined by Tony Wickenden, Managing Director of Technical Connection. He's back with us for the third time this year, and his timing is impeccable following yesterday's significant announcement from the UK government. Back in mid-March, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, announced that he would do whatever it takes to see the UK through the crisis. Well, today, Tony joins us to examine the relationship between the government debt and GDP, what the future of tax will look like, and what various potential tax changes might mean for financial planning strategy. There will be an opportunity for you to ask Tony questions during the event. There's the chat box to the right of the screen where you can type these questions in. Following Tony's sessions, our content editor, Natalie Holt, will be joining Tony to discuss some of the themes of his presentation and, of course, pose your questions to Tony, so please do not be shy. A few have let us know that the sound has been a little low on these events over the past couple of weeks. We think we've improved that today, but if you do experience any problems during the event, sound related or otherwise, please drop a note to events@nucleusfinancial.com and our events team will get right back to you. That's everything from me just now. Enjoy today's session. Please do get involved. Tony, over to you.
Cheers, thanks, Alan. And afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all happy with your tears. As Alan said, pretty good timing, I think, really, given the financial statement yesterday, or the spending review yesterday by the Chancellor. So with that in mind, I thought I'd try and channel my inner Chancellor with my bracelet, my Rishi bracelet, and just to do a little bit. This is just to take away from the board, and my hoodie. If anyone saw that little thing of him, he was very hoodied up, so I thought I'd get mine on. It's the only one I've got, actually, because people over 60 shouldn't really have hoodies. Right, I'm ready. Okay. Thanks. Right, this is, it already doesn't seem like it, a structured learning session. So we need to have learning outcomes, and they are these. You don't need me to read them out for us, so I'll just let that sit there for a minute. That's what we're going to end up learning after today, with the benefit of your questions, of course. All right, good to go and move on from that. I want to start with this, actually, and I think it's quite important, the trust equation. This isn't the equation, these are the scores we'd be looking to get in a good trust equation. So what is this equation? It underpins all that's good in a relationship between an advisor and your client. Basically, if you don't score well on this, you should question the value of your relationship. You can try this on yourself. You could try it with your personal relationships, basically, because a good score will say, yeah, actually, I'm doing all right in the context of this relationship. So we want high scores above the line and a low score below the line. This is leading to a point, actually. So credibility, knowing what you're talking about, basically people trust you. Recent research by the ILC has confirmed how important that is to people in their relationships. We're looking at the non-financial benefits of advice, really important. Reliability, obviously doing what you say you do. So expertise, know-how, credibility, reliability, showing up, doing what you say you're going to do. And intimacy, really important, that you're likable, that you can relate to people. So you can really know your stuff, but I really don't like them, is not very good. So you want, if the score, the best you can get is 5 and the lowest you can get is 1, you want lots of 5s above the line and a 1 below the line. Self-orientation, it's not about you, it's about them. Truly being present when you're speaking to your client, when you're listening to your client, more to the point. So that's important, and that credibility point is really important. And this is where we can really get some value out of the credit, really score high in the credibility point. So contextual knowledge and specific know-how is, I think, what generates your credibility score. And in the context of the contextual knowledge, double use of the context word, then an essential prerequisite to having an informed view is to know what's going on. There's a few musical references through this. Rishi gave us another one to start with yesterday. You know, what's going on? Actually, this, one of the best albums ever produced, in my view, by a brilliant singer. It's in relation to what's going on in the news. Another musical reference, slightly older. I read the news today. Oh Boy, from Sgt. Pepper, Beatles. And again, more Beatles, overweight in Beatles, to use investment terminology. That sounds like it's like a jungle quiz, doesn't it? Overweight in Beatles, they're all coming down on me, and mealworms and everything. Get on with it, Tone. Right, okay, help. Lots of financial help has been given, of course, to stave off the economic impact of COVID. So that probably has to be paid for, doesn't it? And that's where we got to yesterday with it was the spending side of the equation. We haven't got the tax side. We'll deal with that in a minute, and we're still waiting to know exactly what that looks like, and we're definitely going to have to wait a little bit longer. But yesterday's headlines, I'll just read from this old school piece of paper. And the first song reference actually given us by Rishi Sunak was a Carpenter's one, because he said the health challenge isn't over and the economic challenge has only just begun. Get that? Okay, right, so total borrowing 394 billion. 394 billion. We got so used to talking in billions, we could be Damien or poor Giamatti, couldn't we? By the end of the year. So nearly 400 billion, and it was scheduled to be 55 at the time of the March budget. So massive, massive increase. It equates to 19% of GDP, apparently. The economy won't be back to pre-COVID levels until 2022. The economy will be 3% smaller than it was projected to be in 2025 as a result of this. Unemployment, sadly, is going to be 7.5%, according to the OBR, in the second quarter of next year. Scars will be felt till the middle of the decade. I'll finish reading in a minute. Largest fall in GDP of 11% in 300 years. It's worth repeating. The largest fall in GDP by 11% in 300 years. And the GDP underlying debt relationship is 100%, which leads us to this point here. 100%, the amount that we owe is equal to 100% of the amount that we produce. So that's the underlying debt, not the public sector net borrowing, but total underlying government debt equals 100% of what we produce. And that word that pops to mind most readily in that context is unprecedented, except it isn't. We've been there and worse before. And you must have picked up this over the last couple of days. People have been talking about First World War, Second World War, and it tends to be events like that, challenges, national challenges that cause the debt GDP relationship to get so out of whack. And the last time it was so out of whack was Second World War. So we're looking at 250% was the relationship. Debt equated to 250% of GDP, and it took years to get it down to whatever was seen as manageable, but certainly to get down to 100%. Where we are now took from sort of 1945 till the early 60s to get that down. It's a gradual process. So that's something I think we've got to understand, and we've been given that message quite strongly over the last few weeks and before that, to say this doesn't need to be dealt with and won't be dealt with and can't be dealt with immediately. So it's not, oh God, we've got to pay it back, the bailiffs are coming round. It's no, we need a structure in place, a strategy in place to do it over time. And it won't be done by one single measure and doesn't need to be either. Reassuringly, of course, currently, Ken Clarke was casting some doubt over the reliance on this. That is interest rates, because at the moment the cost of service is cheap money. The cost of servicing the debt is immensely low. 30-year gilts, 0.9% yield. You know, it's very affordable to get this money. And ex-chancellor was just saying, what if interest rates change? That could change the whole feeling around the size of this government debt. At the moment, can be a little bit calm about it. And the other thing, of course, is the importance of the relationship between debt and GDP. It's that, you know, a debt of £10,000 to someone who earns £10,000 would seem pretty overwhelming. But a debt of £10,000 to someone who earns £500,000 seems nothing. So, you know, that if we can get the relationship right, then the size of the debt matters less, pretty obviously. Right. Also, we can be reassured that, or the Chancellor can, that he's doing the right thing by what other people say, whose opinion you value. So the MD of the International Monetary Fund said that continued policy support is essential to address the pandemic and invigorate a recovery. So basically, keep the main thing right now. Sorry, should have turned those off. And even wait to put public finances back on and wait to put public finances back onto an even keel. But eventually, we do need to look at raising taxes and recalibrating spending. And a start was made on that yesterday, wasn't it, with the targeted pause or freeze on public sector pay, for example, lower foreign aid, for example, getting rid of the RPI by 2030, for example. All of those things are targeted, focused spending reductions that don't amount to anyone calling it that strategy austerity, because that is something the government want to stay way away from. In addition, the Institute of Fiscal Studies have said, yeah, you should do that, but at some point you're going to need about 40 billion a year of extra income or taxes to repair public finances. So how do the government cut the debt GDP ratio? They don't need to do it right now, but a strategy needs to be put in place or thought about to take effect. Most people seem to be saying within the next 2 to 3 years, a start's been made on it already on the spending side, and we might see the beginnings of a start, the start of a start, and next year when we have the budget. But a combination of these things historically have been shown to work. Inflation, which was extremely helpful in relation to the debt post-war, because it diminishes the real value of the debt. Obviously, when you come to the time of repay it, you issue a 30-year gilt. When you come to repay it, it seems less, 20 million billion seems worth less than it was when you first borrowed the money. But inflation at the moment is quite low. Who knows what it will look like going forward? Economic growth obviously helps to restore that balance to more reasonable levels between debt and growth, amount you produce. Spending less, clearly, and we saw, as I said, the start to that process yesterday, and government will continue to look at that, and we'll pick up on the point of pensions and tax reliefs in a minute as a way of reducing spending. And tax more, get more money in from existing taxes, or introduce new taxes where appropriate. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. Another still overweight in bills. Got anyone else you can refer to? We haven't even got money in here. So taxation, this is a George Harrison line from that Taxman song. Let me tell you how it will be, 1 for you, 19 for me. How bad can it get? Well, back in the 60s, it was as bad as 98%, 75% on earned income, 13% on investment income equals 98%. No wonder we had the brain drain and all that. Are we going to be looking at changes, or will it all just remain hunky-dory? Stop with the song references. I've gone a bit mad on those. Right, taxation. There's no doubt that if you want to get money in from taxation, getting a small amount from a wider base will probably give you the best outcome. Now, the government has to manage the financial impact or benefit of tax change against how it looks, fairness and the political aspect of this. But there's no doubt, the majority of tax is got from those top three: income tax, national insurance and VAT, which generate way more than any other of the taxes. We're edging towards 500 billion a year from those three taxes. And you can see, wow, corporation tax, that seems like it'd be a big tax. Well, it's much, much less than those others. Council tax, business rates, and we haven't, capital taxes don't even make the top 6, basically. So they're not in Europe. So if that's the case, getting a small amount from the biggest tax base, let's have a look at that, shall we? Yeah, except that in the manifesto, the government said, we promise not to raise the rates of income tax, national insurance or VAT. So the talk here is, if they did want to do that, then how would the country react to, oh no, a U-turn? Well, countries got quite used to them. So I think, people might look at it if it had some justification. The thing you have to bear in mind, of course, with any tax increase is that overriding thing at the moment of keeping the main thing. What would that do to the economy? If you increase VAT, would that cause people to go out and spend more or spend less? Probably less. If they had less money in their pay packet at the end of the month or the week, because they're paying more income tax, would they spend more or spend less? Probably less. So I think, whilst that's the natural place to go, the economic damage it could do, certainly right now, is one that militates against any immediate change, I think, to those tax rates. Maybe famous last words. Just as a point here, when a lot of the discussion when it comes to tax is around the commentators generally and people generally saying it's those who can best afford it who should shoulder the burden. You tend to find in those YouGov pieces of research and surveys that people vote for tax increases as being a good thing when they won't be affected by it, generally speaking. And just to look at this, that's being a bit cynical, I know, but probably true. 1% on any of those NIC, income tax, VAT, 1% on any of those, either of those, would generate 6 to 7 billion per annum, okay, per annum a year. To get the same amount of money, the net yield, 6 to 7 billion, you'd have to increase higher rate tax by 4.2 pence in the pound, because there's less people to give you that same amount of money, or 28p in the pound, and then we're getting into Beatles territory on an additional rate tax, 28p in the pound, or 2% on corporation tax. We'll look at corporation. So all of that needs to be borne very carefully in mind, I think, before any tax change is made. On spending, and this is sort of spending because you're giving relief to encourage people to change their behaviour, which is what pensions relief was designed to do. Whether it does its job anymore, or if it ever did, is another matter. Because about over 70%, I think, last time I looked at this, of the relief, the value of the relief on pensions goes to higher rate and additional rate taxpayers, who generally speaking are more likely to get the message behind pensions than basic rate taxpayers. Hence, we have much discussion from time to time over flat rate relief, a higher flat rate relief. So encouraging basic rate taxpayers with a little more money, may be characterised different as well. So if you were able to characterise what you get as a reward for investing in pensions in the shape of money, a bit like the lifetime ISA is sort of done as a bonus as opposed to tax, because people don't understand tax, generally speaking. I don't mean that to be all demeaning, but it's just generally proven to be the case. Characterise it differently might get people to get it more. Don't know. And also, you know, going to flat rate, it wouldn't, if the motivation is saving money, you might not save money. If people do get the message, you might end up paying it out even more money, because you'll be paying to a wider base, giving them more relief, as it were, than they're currently getting at 20p in the pound. They get 25p, for example. And actually making these changes, on the face of it, they seem quite easy, just make it flat rate relief. Then it has all sorts of other repercussions. For example, if you're in a pension scheme and your employer's paying, you're a higher rate taxpayer, and you're now no longer getting higher rate tax relief, you're not on your own contributions, but your employer pays the contribution, or you own the business and your employer, which is you, pays the contribution, then you sort of get higher rate relief anyway, because you're getting a pension contribution as opposed to a salary. How do you compensate for that? How does the government compensate for that? Well, by making some kind of clawback, a tax assessment on the individual. And then that all gets quite complicated. Most recently, the Public Accounts Committee, and they're prone to, and they're charged with challenging the government, say, have a look at this. And they said, you should look at pensions tax relief again. They've done that this year. And the government said, yeah, we've done that before. On a few occasions, most recently in 2015 with the comprehensive review, we don't feel it's the right time to do that again. So people could take some reassurance from that there won't be any change. But then again, we are in, you know, extenuating circumstances. The times have got stranger by the day, and so you wouldn't say, oh, we can hook our feelings to that and we don't need to do anything about this. I think we'd say you couldn't rule that out, and you'd say to clients, if you have unused relief, pensions are absolutely the right thing. It's appropriate for you. You've got the money to do it, and it's just been a matter, yeah, I haven't got round to it. Then probably better to do it sooner rather than later. It's the same when we come up to any budget. Not that we're approaching a budget yet at the minute. So that's what I wanted to say on pensions. Capital gains tax been in the news. And although these two taxes, capital gains tax and inheritance tax, don't generate huge amounts by comparison to income tax and NIC and VAT in tax, they do generate a lot of conversation and anger and feeling, and they are very relevant to the financial planning process for many of us in the sector, because many of our clients are worried about this, are concerned about this being capital taxes. So when you look at the amount it generates, is £10 billion. It's no small sum, but compared to income tax, it's relatively small. Interesting factor here, which I think might give us some guidance as to whether any change is likely. And of course, the Office of Tax Simplification have been recently charged with looking at this, and have recently, very recently, last couple of weeks, issued their first report, which I'll look at in a minute. 90%, this is the interesting bit, I think 90% of the capital gains tax paid, this is one of those, if it all goes quiet when you're down the pub, although you can't be down the pub with your family over Christmas, only inside your house. But if it goes quiet after lunch and everyone's a bit full up and it's a bit, you go, did you know that 90% of the CGT in the UK is paid by 256,000 individuals. Did you know that could be something that came out of a cracker? You think that's a joke, but it's true. 10% by trustees, and even more so, over half of the CGT yield is paid by 10,000 individuals. So, and half of it is paid by 10,000 individuals. The point at this that I found interesting is that, so if you change CGT and made it much worse than it is currently, one, you'd look good in that you're levelling up and putting it on the shoulders, giving the burden to the shoulders of those who can most afford it. And two, politically, you wouldn't upset that many people. Just saying, really. So quite interesting. So the reform, don't need to dwell on this. All that's been done. The letter of request has been issued from the Chancellor to the OTS, the Office of Tax Simplification, a Treasury body. A scoping document was issued, call for evidence, and the first report was published on the 11th of November this month. So what did it say? The first report, quite a lot. And the OTS might have quite liked this broad brief they were given, much broader than the brief they were given on inheritance tax. So they had a look at it. They had a look and they said, what about these? Consider these things. Now, this isn't official policy. They're just saying we've reviewed it. We've taken on board what people have said, both the professional sector and individuals generally who felt minded to send in stuff to us. And we come up with this as things for the government to consider. And we've had no official response from the government to the recommendations or suggestions put forward by the OTS. Okay, so number one, and this was not unexpected, I think, because we've been there before. Until 2000, for 20 years up to 2008, gains were taxed as income. So should we do that again? From a fairness standpoint, the OTS say, and others, the Resolution Foundation, for example, it's a bit odd, don't you think, that you work and your income's taxed at this rate, i.e. 20, 40, 45, broadly. And then you make a capital gain and it's taxed at half those rates, leaving aside the exemption. Just a bit odd, really. So the government has said maybe we should just be fair, not the government, the OTS, and link capital gains to income. So just basically add it to your income and tax it at the same rate, 40 or 20 or 45. If you're going to do that, though, they said it's only fair that we should reintroduce indexation like what we did in the past, some form of recognition of inflation as a contributor to the gain. Okay, so if you don't do that, they said, because they put forward options, if you don't do that, then simplify CGT. The CGT shouldn't be dependent on the taxpayer's income, because at the moment it is. You know, if you're a basic rate taxpayer, you pay 10, leaving aside exemptions. If you're a higher rate taxpayer or additional rate taxpayer, you pay 20. So don't decouple and have a CGT rate that isn't dependent on someone's income. That would be simpler. Then they said, and another thing, you should look at the way in which behaviours are changed by virtue of the fact that that's quite a low tax rate. So if we could remunerate or get money out from somewhere in a way that suffers that and characterise it, turn it in like tax alchemy, turn it into a capital gain, then you'll get that lower rate. How can we do that? Remunerate in shares. So when you get your reward for the effort that you put into the business that you work for or own, and you get that reward in shares, let's look at maybe taxing that differently. Shouldn't it be taxed as income? So looking at some share schemes, not all of them, you know, some schemes that are permitted and encouraged, the smaller end, should stay, but remuneration in shares. And also those people who own their own businesses, they can build up cash inside their company and then eventually liquidate it or take it out as a capital gain and pay the lower capital gains tax rates, possibly even reduced even further by business assets disposal relief, entrepreneurs relief as was. So they said we should really review that too. Blimey, that's only the first little spike on my diagram. No rebasing on death. What's that? Well, best form of CGT planning is to die. I know people wouldn't put that as part of their plan, but if you do, all your past taxable gains are wiped out. You know that. Your economic gains are still there, but whoever inherits a fresh base value and doesn't pay tax on all those built up gains to the point of inheritance. They say maybe that shouldn't happen anymore. And if it doesn't, then there's a kind of little giveaway. If you've got long held assets, you could rebase them to the year 2000 value. There's another song reference, Jarvis Cocker. to the year 2000 value, to wipe out some of the past gains, and also holdover relief for all gifts, so that means you can defer holdover the gain on a gift, not just a gift of a business asset or into a trust. So there's some things, other things that have been suggested. There's so much in this CGT reform proposals. Entrepreneurs, business assets disposal relief, and you're saying, oh, come on, leave it out, as we say in South London. Probably lots of parts of London, actually, and the country. Anyway, leave it out. Why do you want to change it? We've already just changed it. You've brought down that cumulative lifetime limit from £10 million to 1 million. Isn't that enough? Then OTS have said, actually, does it really do its job? Have we got this all wrong, really? Shouldn't we just be encouraging the front end of the process, of the journey towards building a business, as opposed to rewarding the back end when you actually sell? So just have a look at that, they've said. And then said, but if you keep it the way it is, then maybe you should change the conditions, make the shareholding, the ownership provisions a little more strenuous. So you should own at least 25% of the business. You should have owned it for a longer period than the very short period of ownership required under business assets disposal relief. There's another bad song reference. 10 years, how about that? And maybe there should be an age qualification, because way back in the day, some of you might remember, there was this relief called retirement relief, which was the forerunner of entrepreneurs relief, one of the forerunners. We've had something like that for many years, but retirement relief, and you got it when you sold your business when you were past a certain age. I think it was 55, and you get more relief the older that you got, basically. So that's all up for grabs now. The annual exemption, oh, come on, the annual exemption. Yeah, saying, isn't that a bit too high at the moment? What was its purpose, they say, the OTS? If it was to be a de minimis kind of exemption, keeping an eye on the time, right, okay. If this was to be a de minimis exemption, isn't it a bit too high? It's really encouraging behaviours we see that encourage people to just make sure they use it every year, because it gets lost if you don't use it every year. And that encourages people to, sell down portfolio, buy back shares of a similar class, or shares of a similar class, so that you don't trip over the 30-day bed and breakfast rule. So it's encouraging behaviours to just get the relief. Yeah, okay, because it's a relief that's available. So why you'd expect that to happen? So the government, OTS have said, but that isn't what it was. If your purpose, your policy purpose, was to just have a de minimis level to say, look, we don't want to mess about people doing tax returns for small amounts, that's too large. They're saying, have a think about that. And then the private residence exemption, phew, nothing said broadly. So that was what a lot of reform considerations for Rishi. Is probably going, oh, for God's sake, we've thrown all this at me for. I've got enough to deal with. I did ask. Well, you did ask. So that's what they've suggested. And inheritance tax, they also, OTS, made some recommendations for inheritance tax, but way back, because the request to have a look at inheritance tax was made by Philip Hammond. Remember him? Nice man, Philip Hammond. He said, Ed, have a look at inheritance tax, a much more narrow brief. And they came back, they made these recommendations nearly 2 years ago now. And the government have been a little bit preoccupied with other stuff to get around to have a look at inheritance tax, especially when it only generates 5 billion. I mean, not worth it, is it? A YouGov survey, the most recent one on personal taxes, revealed that even though it's the tax that generates the lowest amount of revenue, it's the most disliked tax in the UK. What an accolade to have. Poor old inheritance tax. And you probably relate to that, just because people just, I've paid tax all my life, and then I die and they're going to take another 40%. It's not right. And people think, I'm not saying it's not right, that's what people say, broadly speaking. So the green bit on the right-hand, turquoisey green bit on the right-hand side of this screen is what broadly the OTS recommended. 5-year accumulation instead of 7. Tick, happy with that. That seems beneficial. The 7-year cumulative period, make it 5. Yeah, okay. Single annual exemption, not your 3,000, your 250, your normal expenditure. Simplify it, because they went down very much a simplification route here. It wasn't big and structural like the OTS have been given the brief to do with CGT. It was more make it simpler. So single annual exemption, but they didn't say how much. No CGT rebasing if IHT free, so you can see that carry through to CGT, except broader, because this was only if you left assets to that was in a way that they were IHT free. So you left them to your spouse, your civil partner. They were business assets, agricultural property, IHT free. So they shouldn't be rebased. You shouldn't get, you know, double relief from capital taxes. So no rebasing, but only if IHT free. The CGT OTS report has gone further, said no CGT rebasing, full stop, on there. All term life policies IHT free. That's an interesting one, really. You think, well, if you've got advice, your life assurance shouldn't be subject to IHT anyway, because it should be in trust or on a life of another basis. So on the left hand, so that was broadly what they suggested. I don't see anything terribly wrong with any of that. And when the government get round to it, they'll probably think seriously about all of that. And then on the other side of the screen, you've got the APPGIIF, you know, them, the all-party parliamentary group for intergenerational and inheritance fairness. Basically, a bunch of politicians that get together and say, what sort of taxes should we look at reforming? So it's more informal. Anyway, they do come together and they do make some recommendations. And interesting, and this is, I think, interesting, they looked at IHT and said, actually, what we found is, strangely, people who have advice pay a lower effective rate of tax. Surprise, surprise, that's what advisors do within the rules. So by asset location and planning generally, we found that the rate of IHT paid by individuals with advice is expressed as a proportion of their total estate is more like 20%. So why do we restrict that 20% rate to just people who can access advice? Let's give it to everyone. So their suggestion is a 20% rate for all for estates over £2 million, and actually a 10% rate for estates below £2 million. And everyone goes, well, yeah, I'll have that. That'll be great. Except that as a corollary to that is we remove the exemptions. You keep the spouse exemption, by the way, and the civil partner exemption, and you do keep what's called a 325,000 death exemption rather than a nil rate ban. So any other gifts made during lifetime, all of that, exempt gift, you can make £30,000 a year. That's your single annual exemption. But aside from that, everything's taxable at the 10 or 20% rate. And that's it, basically. No reliefs, no business relief, no agricultural property relief, no IHT freedom of pensions because you don't need it because the nominal rate is much lower. That's what they said. So then they don't carry anywhere near as much weight as the OTS, because the OTS are Treasury body and they were actually asked to look at it by the Chancellor at the time. But they are MPs, so it won't just be ignored. It's another set of suggestions in there. So at the moment, IHT suggestions in for review, CGT suggestions in for review. So specific know-how. This is it's a great track, Temptations, the way you do the things you do. What do you do? What you do well is intergenerational financial success. In relation to capital taxes, you know, can say, oh, actually, good, you really know your stuff. You know about the OTS reform, you know about the CGT reform, you know about IHT. That's really good. But specifically, now I need you to help me with my plan. Very obviously, it's what you do mostly. And intergenerational financial success, which is a slight diversion here from the main topic of let's look at all the tax changes proposed. But it's really important, I think, just to remind ourselves of intergenerational success and the importance of that to your business to sustain a relationship with the next generation, most obviously. And you get that success through wealth creation and minimising income tax and CGT, wealth preservation, helped by minimising income tax and CGT, wealth transfer, helped by minimising IHT. And there's lots available to us. It's a little reminder session. Don't forget, of course, you know, everything you can do to give away assets during lifetime will diminish the IHT, will improve the wealth transfer experience. But making gifts of certain assets during lifetime is difficult. Why? The gift with reservation provisions and the pre-owned assets tax provisions. So quick reminder of those. So I really believe that what you can actually do in relation to inheritance tax planning, intergenerational planning, is very much determined by what you own, rather than the theory of use your nil rate ban, make sure you use your annual exemptions, use your 7-year clock period to make gifts and then survive 7 years. Yeah, all very well if you've got the right assets, because try giving your house away if you want to carry on living in it. So all of this is easy. If you don't really need the asset anymore at all and don't want any control of it, just give it away. If you want control, you can do a lot with trusts, of course, and you've got a great range of trusts available to you within the Nucleus platform. as well as external product providers. And then you look at your house, you can't really give your house away during lifetime and carry on living in it without paying a full market rent. And if for some that actually works, they pay a full market rent because you pay the rent and it's not a gift for inheritance tax, and that gets more money out of your estate that isn't a gift, and you carry on living in your house as well. So that could work, but not in practice for that many people. Sharing the property with the people you've given your house to is another way, which often doesn't work either, just because of the dynamics of, you know, it's like when kids come back home and your calm and tidiness is completely shattered. Second property is a bit easier because you can pay a little bit for going to live in them when you want to live in them. So, you know, if you've got a holiday home, you could do that. But of course, and you don't really need to do anything terribly hard with your pension or your business at the moment because they qualify for, you know, largely inheritance tax freedom. With cash and investments, then you've got quite a lot of choice, actually. Just make sure you don't reserve a benefit. And that's really easy. If you said, what I want from my inheritance tax giving is to be able to give, but be able to get some money back if I need to. I never know what the future might, you don't know what the future might hold, just in case I can't afford to give it away. Great, you can control who gets what and when, and you can also, of course, it's a big reminder, of course, retain access to the original capital by a loan trust. I don't need to talk more about that. You know how that works. They still work. They're not subject to DOTAS disclosures. They're tried and tested. They're basically a freezer trust, if you want to describe it in that way. You freeze the money at its current value. That's your right as a creditor now, not as a giver who retains access to something they've given. You're a creditor. That's what gets you out of the gift reservation provisions. The growth, hopefully growth is there, on the money that you've lent belongs to the beneficiaries, not you. Your retained right is to that frozen amount of the loan until you decide to let it go. See what I did there? Another song reference from the Disney movie, because you can let it go. Anytime in the future, you can decide, actually, I don't need that reassurance anymore. I can let it go. I can give up my loan, and that's when the gift is made. Discounted gift trust, a way of retaining control through the trust, but also access, but not to the capital, to regular payments. And that has the benefit that when you make the gift, the amount you've given is lower, hence the discount. Why is it lower? Because you give an amount away that is subject to a retained right to regular payment. So what you've given away is the value of what you've given away, less the value of your retained right. So if you did die within 7 years of gift, the amount that's taken into account in deciding your inheritance tax liability on the gift and how much of your nil rate ban you've used up is less than you actually gave and what the beneficiaries will actually receive, because it was discounted by the value of your retained right, which, by the way, now has no value in your estate because it was only there for your lifetime and you ain't there. Right. Quick revision session. Of course, wills, lasting powers of attorney, really important to have in place to achieve that intergenerational success. And there's something here I've been talking about a little bit. I've been quite pleased with this analogy of insurance protection in trust representing the core strength in your financial plan. If you said, you know, your overall physical well-being is made better by having good core strength. If you can do your biceps and your thighs and all that and you come out, but you've got no core strength, you can't withstand shock, you've got bad posture. And the analogy was, without protection at the heart of your wealth plan, you've got no core strength. The plan could all fall apart by your death or being seriously ill. So I'm encouraging people to just re-engage with the value of protection, because we can get a bit carried away with wealth management and wealth creation, understandably. But I'm just saying, don't be the advisor who is the one who didn't have the discussion, at least, about the importance of protection. Yeah, so basically you don't need to worry about IHT on certain aspects. Where you do and you can't give the assets away to diminish your IHT on it, life assurance in trust plays a pretty key part of providing for the inheritance tax, and it is absolutely unchallengeable. You are not reducing your estate at all. You are a bit by the premiums, but they're exempt. The big number, of course, is completely tax-free. And I'm not making an apology for reminding you of that again, the importance of how life insurance to families generally and to achieving intergenerational success, even improving intergenerational success, because of you could create a legacy through life insurance. End of life insurance encouragement session. Right, corporation tax, lower. It was expected to be 65 billion, the yield on this at the beginning of the year. unsurprisingly, the yield is going to be less because corporations have made less money. Not all corporations, but most have made less money. Will we see an increase in the rate? I suspect not. Definitely not over the next year, because, you know, whether we get a deal or no deal or whatever the Brexit outcome is, God forbid, then we do need to have an environment that is at least tax friendly to do business in. And that means, I think, not increasing the corporation tax rate generally. I think it was going to go down to 17, and they already decided in the last budget in March that they'd keep it at 19%, which saved about 6 billion, I think, actually. So that was a bit of pre-saving. Wealth tax, getting to the end, then we'll do some questions. Wealth tax, interesting. Subject has been raised as a sort of one-off, as a special solidarity COVID tax, that kind of thing. And you do find, as I said, people go, yeah, that should definitely be done. Not me, though, by the way, not me. That's what tends to happen. The why, so much, the why it's discussed is we could solve this government debt problem. It doesn't need to be solved, as hopefully I've explained, and you knew anyway. It doesn't need to be solved immediately. Oh, let's go back. So, but if you did, and Manchester Metropolitan University just did a little academic study on a kind of just saying basis, said, look, if we got 2% from the entirety of personal wealth, housing, pension, all that, if we got 2%, this was way back in about April, they said this, April, May, then you know, guess what? It would yield 300 billion. Job done. That would be your COVID, that could do all your COVID support. You wouldn't need to borrow anything, just 2% on everything. So 2% seems quite low, doesn't it? Just 2%. So that isn't what got people thinking, but it added to the debate, and it was published in the FT, I think. So the challenges we've seen to wealth tax, so yeah, that's all very well, but you know, people who might have a £1 million value house might not have any money. So actually getting the tax becomes more difficult. And you go, well, you could put a charge on it. Yeah, that you could, and it's paid on death. So that basically means a bit like IHT, really. It's an increase, a special extra IHT rate. So all of that is all possible, of course. This government, I don't think, is probably predisposed to doing anything about it. But around the world, we've seen the experience being in the UK. Dennis Healey, do you remember that? Those again who are old enough to remember that Labour Chancellor back in the 70s with the big eyebrows. He had a look at wealth tax and decided, after a green paper was published on it, a lot of thought was given to it, just that it basically put it in the too hard box. In the USA, you might remember Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, sort of the left-wing side of the Democrats, were really keen on a wealth tax on the super rich, and there's more of them in the USA. So they would look at generating quite a lot of money from those. Obviously, well, not obviously, but Joe has less of an inclination to introduce a wealth tax. I'm assuming he actually gets in the White House at some point soon. And in Europe, we have a wealth tax. I found this quite interesting, a bit of research, and you go, there is a wealth tax in Spain, Switzerland and Norway. It's quite at a low level, quite complex, especially in Switzerland because of the canton basis of assessment, the regions there. Difficult to collect. In Spain, actually, there is a wealth tax in Spain, except not in Madrid. That seems a bit odd. Funny, the government's actually in Madrid. If you live in Madrid, there's no wealth tax, but outside there is. So that. And France and Belgium. So that's actually big kudos to Thomas Partey to coming over to the Arsenal. He was living in Madrid and he's come to a country. Actually, we don't have wealth tax either, so no, not such a big deal. And he's injured. So France and Belgium have a wealth tax, but it's only on property. A bit like council tax, and some suggest maybe that's something we could look at here at reviewing council tax assessment levels. And there is this point with all tax increases, as well as economic activity, that it could harm by having tax increases that are too hard. There is this is another little thing you can throw. You're having a laugh at. Arthur Laffer. How can an economist be called Arthur Laffer? He was in the US. Just made this point. It's quite interesting. It's very obvious, actually, to say, look, you can increase tax rates along that bottom horizontal axis. As you increase the rates along the bottom axis, the tax revenue goes up, unsurprisingly. So when you get from zero, you get no tax. because it's right on the bottom point. Then as you increase it along there, you go, oh, you're getting more tax. Go a little bit further, getting more tax. Go a little bit further, getting more tax. If you can see my pointer. But then you reach this point, which is the revenue maximizing point, which varies depending on each country and what culture you're in. But then you start increasing the tax, keep on increasing the tax along the bottom axis, moving towards 100%. And when you reach 100%, that looks like the best, but 100% tax, that'll get you loads of money, except that it doesn't, because people change their behaviors and their location, and you actually see a decline in the revenue once you reach this point. And many people think that 40% point is about that point in the UK for income tax, because after that, people will start to think more vigorously about changing their behaviors or even leaving the country. So that's something else you need to bear in mind. When will we know? Well, when will I know is the song reference, if you wanted that, the Whitney Houston song. But when will we know? More next year. I think in the budget, the autumn budget was cancelled, and we're seeing that all the way through. The Chancellor saying we will have a strategy, we need to restore public finances, but not yet. There's no silver bullet, and here comes now an overweight in song reference. There's no rubber bullets. I just got mad on this with bullets. There's no good track list by LaRue, bulletproof, a little bit younger, that one. Bullet the Blue Sky, none of that either, and not even the best bullet of all, super uber cool Steve McQueen. So there'll just be a blended approach. Taxation, economic growth, inflation maybe, and targeted reduced spending. I think we'll get to where we want to be. And remember, on a positive note, Boris, we can get through this. We've been there before and we got there. So let's trust ourselves to all do the right thing. So I think, this doesn't have to be solved overnight. And the great thing about all this for financial advisors being very self-serving is that it doesn't look like the importance of tax and tax planning is going to drop off the menu of important things to do to achieve a great financial outcome anytime soon, which is a phrase that really grates on me, so I shouldn't have said it. Right, learning outcomes. You're going, you're joking. I didn't get any of that, but that's what we were there to achieve. That was our target. Hopefully we got a bit near to some of it. And that leads me to say, let's see what questions we've got. Stay well. Oh, look, I didn't know what that was from an old slide. I've got Chris Wickenden on there, who's on this session is not joining me. Chris, he writes on Nucleus Illuminate. And by the way, you've all got access to TechLink, shouldn't you? You've all got access to TechLink. And all of this stuff I'm talking about much more coherently is in our TechLink bulletins, our TechLink videos, and increasingly now our TechLink animations. So the bulletin that was published today on the spending review is a really good one, mostly because I didn't write it, this morning. And we will be continuing to track anything that's anything to do with tax and the financial planning process. So don't forget, go to TechLink. You have access to that because of your Nucleus affiliation. That's me.
Great, thank you, Tony. Got a bit of an echo here, but hopefully some magicians in the background can kind of sort that out. Right, so thanks so much for that, and for getting through so much ground. That was amazing what you've got through in just kind of 45 minutes. So thank you for that. So we're going to take your questions now from those of you watching at home. But before we do, there's just a couple of things that I need to run through with you. So I know that a lot of you are familiar with the format of this now and how this all works, but I also know that there's a few of you who are joining us for the first time. So I'll just do a quick run through of how this all works. So you'll see the chat function on the right hand side of your screen. And if you're watching us in full screen, you might just need to click out of that in order that you can view it. If you're still seeing a register button, please click on that, fill in your name and your email address, and then you click on the speech bubble, and that will take you through to where you can type in your questions and your comments for Tony, which I can already see are already coming through. You'll see the other questions being asked, and you can also vote for the ones that you really want me to ask Tony. Even if you don't have any questions, I would ask that you please put in your details anyway, because then that means we can send you all your post-event materials, including your CPD certificate. Right, so that's all of that stuff done. Tony, I'll bring you back in now. So I'll start with one of my own questions, then I'll start with some of the questions that are coming through on the feed as well. So obviously, the big news is what Rishi was saying yesterday in terms of the spending review and all the kind of latest forecasts from the Office of Budget Responsibility, or OBR is easier for me to say. And Rishi talked about, there was a lot of kind of doom and gloom. He talked about an economic emergency. He talked the increase in spending and things like that. So, and borrowing particularly. So how did the forecasts fit into what you've been talking about today? And do you think they bring the prospect of tax changes closer in that we need to kind of raise this money, or further away in that they need to be pumping the money in and not taxing people?
Sort of a bit of both. There is definitely there was a recognition yesterday. Also, it's great how we, both of us, and in fact everyone, refers to him as Rishi, and I don't think there's been another chancellor as if we're on first name terms and we went, oh yeah,
just friendly,
Anyway, so yeah, so I think there was a clear reference to, but only one reference to, about repairing public finances. So I think there is a recognition, but the clear thing about dealing with the emergency first and keeping the main thing means, I think it sort of gives us some reassurance that it's not going to happen immediately, but some awareness that it is going to happen at some time, but it isn't all going to be about tax. I think they gave that message quite clearly, that it was going to be a combination of things, which was fortunate because that's what I had on my slides. But yeah, I think a combination, but we're not going to get away with no tax increases whatsoever on any tax. I think that's absolutely certain. And it's just about when that starts, really. I think you could probably start, they could make a start with the capital taxes, because that's not going to massively damage the economy. I think those taxes on corporation tax, because that could also flow through to prices, because companies tend to do that if they have to pay more out. That's reflected through a little bit into prices. And income tax would take money out of people's pockets, and VAT definitely would, and national insurance. So they're the ones that I think could generate the most money, but are the ones they'll be most cautious about introducing early. And the CGT and IHT ones won't generate much money, but will give the impression they're doing something. So maybe that, you just don't know. So I think definitely going to come, maybe not immediately, or definitely not immediately. And we'll see a little bit more. It's a bit of a cop out, this, but when the next budget will give us some indication, because this bit is one side of the whole picture, isn't it? It's the spending side, and the next bit is about the revenue fiscal side, and we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah,
but definitely
so
coming.
We know something is coming, but we just can't really say when until it all shakes
No, and I
out.
think it's important for advisors to just give that balance to clients, and to take the emotion out of decisions. We had a question yesterday about, when I should be looking to get buyers for my business then? And you go, well, that's, there's much more to it than that as to whether it's the right time to sell you, but forget tax. Tax is secondary. Is there likely to be any change? And I think it's one of those things like pensions. If you're going to do it anyway, and you like the system as it exists, then think about doing something about it, but don't do something about it because of a rumour or a potential of tax change just yet. Definitely. I think the advisor has a really important job to play there, as that ILC research pointed out, in taking the emotion out of decisions, being someone who can just, you can talk to a client and just give balance to this rather than acting irrationally. It's a big part of where the alpha in advice comes from. In having an advisor, it's proved so often that having an advisor it's more about having the discussion and making balanced decisions, is where the end game comes from, that extra 1 or 2% that you get by being advised.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way in investing, isn't it? If there's lots of noise happening, but your plans haven't changed, then, you're still staying the course, and in the same like this, I guess.
Definitely.
So we've had some comments and some questions come through, so I'll just kind of move to take some of these. So Oliver Moore, hi Oliver. He says, can you supply the song list? And we've got a lot of comments on that theme, so that's great. So we'll have to do some
There's better songs than those.
Playlist.
That's great. Playlist, yeah.
I don't know. But in terms of the actual questions then, so Austin Flood asks, and he kind of picks up on my point, I guess, because he asks, what do you think the timeline for these changes will be? But specifically, he asks, should we be more careful in recommending some products such as BPR compliant investments?
I don't think at the moment. I suppose you could say if one of the drivers for business relief investments is the fact they'll be IHT free, and then you need the problem with all of this is right now if they're right for the client, taking account of access to funds, liquidity, risk. If they're right, then the IHT system says, and they do that job as it exists. I suppose the point is to say, would you still make the investment if the IHT relief wasn't there? Projecting forward to if there's change to IHT and you don't need business relief investments because there's no business relief, would that investment still be appropriate? And if it wouldn't, is that something that should militate against your decision to make the investment now? And I suppose if there's that fear, I suppose in talking to the client, because you can't really make the decision for them, because look, I think it's appropriate to expose to the client that this is something that is under review. Inheritance tax change could. So if you're making this investment, bear in mind that it works right now. And I suppose if you're going to make the investment now, bear in mind that you might not need it only might not need it in the future. Point is, you could die, before that change comes in, and it would do its job. So I think it's appropriate to tell clients that IHT is something that the government will be looking at. But then you could say that about any tax, and I suppose to not do any. The client could decide, okay, well, that IHT is so important to me, and I believe, because only the client can do their risk assessment, I think really, that tax change is likely to be made, in which case I'm not going to make the investment because I wouldn't do it other than for the IHT investment. It's a really difficult one. All of this is really different. I feel really bad at not being able to, you can't give definite answers to this. Change could come, but remember that removal of business relief is not something that's been suggested by the OTS. So I definitely put that change was an APP GIIF recommendation, which went along with a very radical reduction of IHT to 10 and 20%. So my gut feel around that is that I think I'll put that in the low end of possibilities because it's a tax reduction, and it would look bad because there's a lot of people who aren't even going to be paying inheritance tax, because of the nil band, which still exists, and the spouse exemption, so it pushes it back. So is the government likely to go, guess what we're doing? We're reduced, because it wouldn't play that well, I don't think. Sorry for talking so much, thinking out loud, but, introducing, guess what we're going to do? It's a 10% and 20% rate of inheritance tax. What? At a time when we need to get more money in? That, without understanding the nuances, go, that doesn't seem like the right thing to do. So I would think that as low, having talked that through to myself. The OTS changes, quite likely, but they don't go with a 10 or 20% IHT rate. They stick with a 40% rate, in which case I would go with, the BPR, the business relief investments are still appropriate. And the OTS haven't suggested any change to those. Now, whether the government would say, there's a higher requirement of involvement to qualify for business relief, as there was way back in the past, you used to be a working director to qualify for business relief on fairness grounds, then that could happen. But you'd think that investments that have already been made would retain their relief. You couldn't guarantee it, but that quite often happens.
Okay.
Blimey, that was a rambling answer. Good
so
question,
I guess be mindful of what's happening in that space, but you can't commit, obviously. But just kind of be aware of the backdrop to all of that.
That's a much better answer.
Because you gave me the wisdom and then I spat it back out. That's what it is. Right, so we've got a lot
that with my money marketing articles. You wrote that and then you edit it down to something that actually means something.
The magic pen. Right, so we've got a lot of great comments for your presentation, which is lovely to see. So David Toner says, thanks, like the song references, great presentation from Dan Page, really enjoyed it. Stephen Page, thanks Tony, great presentation. So that's all very lovely.
Both of you.
Michael Rendell says, thank you for some informative data and overview. And then Austin has come back with another question. So he says, some individuals have already spoken to me regarding their concerns around CGT. We also have some clients on a more long-term plan. Are we expected just to continue as best we can until border changes are announced?
Yes, an interesting one also. And with the changes, if there were changes to CGT, say linking it to income tax, I think the rebasing point is something we don't need to sort of plan for. But if it were changing it to income tax, then it does rather throw out, it should encourage us to think about, so what's the best wrapper for our investment? You can buy, I want to go in these funds, which you can get inside your pension, your ISA, your OIC, your unit trust, or your investment bond. Does it change those decisions? Selling your business is another thing, of course. And I think if any changes came in, I think they're likely to be from budget day, because you can do that with capital gains tax really, rather than the income tax and the personal allowance and all of that tends to be by tax year. But CGT probably could come in overnight, in which case, you know, I think there'd be very little time to plan unless you've got wind of this, you know, which at the moment we haven't got. All we've got is the OTS reform. When we see the government's response to that, that might up the anxiety level a little bit more to encourage you to maybe think about taking action. Because I think longer term, you could look at where you wrap your investments. Is in our world, that's probably the most important thing. You go, it ups the attraction of an ISA. So at the moment you go, well, not many people pay CGT, you can manage it, you can use the annual exemption. If you get a diminishment of the annual exemption and a linking of capital gains to income tax, you go, oh, actually the ISA looks and the pension look even more attractive for your capital gains in your portfolio. And then do you look at any kind of resurgence of the investment bond in relation to a competitor to an unwrapped investment? And currently an unwrapped investment, you know, you've got your dividend allowance, you've got your CGT deferment until encashment, you can use your annual exemption, and you look at your bond for once you've gone beyond all of that. And it may be that you look at bonds more favourably, because the big difference there is the disconnect between investment bond taxation. If we had a world where unit trusts and collectives and all of that, where the gains were taxed at income tax rate, you could get this position where you cash in your gain, it's accrued over 20 years, and you cash it in, and that whole gain gets subject to income tax, probably predominantly at your highest rate in that year. Whereas if you'd had that money inside an investment bond for that period, you go, what do we do first? We do top slicing. We divide the gain by the number of years, and we only add that little slice in to see what difference that makes to work out our income tax rate. It may be that the government go, oh yeah, it's only fair that we should allow top slicing for unit trusts as well, or OICs, possibly, because the OTS did say this would produce anomalies if we linked it to income tax. For example, individuals who'd own their investment for a long period, and then in the 1 year, they pay 45%. When they get to the next year and they're basic rate taxpayers again. That they've said that would need to be dealt with. Well, they haven't said how, but there's a pre-existing model that exists for dealing with that called top slicing relief. So I think it would definitely cause us to review how we wrap our investments. It wouldn't mean we necessarily would change, but you could say that definitely changes the landscape of tax, very much so, in relation to the heart of our world, you know, GIA, investment bond, what's the best way to wrap your money based on that new world that we'd be in. But I think it's not a marker now for going, sell down everything and trigger your capital gain, which is a real capital gain now, at a real 20% rate, because that's better than you might have to pay 40% in the future. It's a big call to make there. If you're going to make if you were thinking, I was thinking of turning my portfolio over anyway, that whole thing is like pensions. If you're going to do it anyway, then clearly, yeah, there's an incentive. If you like the current system, it's not going to you're not going to have lower CGT rates. But I'd caution against sort of panic selling, as it were, on the basis that it might end up with a higher rate, because you actually have to pay that money now. So think of the cash flow aspect, pretty obviously.
Great, thank you. So I know that we've gone past 2 o'clock, but I can still see that there's some more questions that have come through. So if you're happy, Tony, we'll just kind of push on for another 5 minutes. And for those of you who need to dash off, I know that some people just try and watch this in their lunch break and then have meetings kind of off the back of it. So if that is the case, don't worry, we're recording, so you can kind of catch up on the rest of Tony's answers on the kind of on-demand version of this. But in the meantime, then I'll try and ask a few of these, because there's a few questions and not a huge amount of time. But Andrew Moore asks, hi Andrew, he says, there's been talk of 3 years of work to change the tax system to facilitate reform of pension tax relief. What would this be? How does this work with DB schemes, public and private? That's a nice brief question to ask you, isn't it?
Just enormous. How it would work, who knows? Because I mentioned that Public Accounts Committee challenge, and you could go back to the 2015 review when they reviewed sort of root and branch and came up with all of those challenges with DB schemes, definitely employer-based schemes, which all militate against the superficial attraction of going flat rate relief, give it into a cash bonus, job done. So it would take some time. I mean, I think you'd have some consultation. I think that's something that definitely would need consultation around the sector, because they can make huge mistakes that they'd have to do many U-turns on. So I think I would see a further consultation period before that were done. I'd encourage people to say, you know, if you've got your existing relief and it's right for you, as I said in the presentation itself, and it might well take, it would certainly take a year, I think, to do that. And I would say, if you want a really good answer to that question, save it up and ask Claire Trott at the next session that she's running next week.
Nice advert for next week. Thank you. Great. So Roy Blacker has asked a question. Do you have any view? Now, he's not as friendly as us with Rishi because he calls him Sunak, but he says, do you have any view on what Sunak taxation charges he would prefer to make, assuming it's still Chancellor Sunak and not Prime Minister by next April budget?
Point.
So there we go.
Good observations. Yeah, good observations. Preference is difficult, isn't it, I suppose, as to what his motivation is. If it was to get as much money in as soon as possible, the preference would be, I think, raising a little bit on income tax and NIC and maybe merging the two together, doing a bit of smoke screening there and just getting from a broader tax base a bigger amount of money in, you know, and it's a low number. He is a conservative chancellor, and you do have, as has proved in the past, as Brexit proved, you know, conservative backbenchers are a pretty difficult bunch to deal with. And so, you know, just going double higher rates of tax just isn't going to play with this. I don't know what he feels. I've no idea. I've never met him. But, you know, just if you're a conservative, you wouldn't be looking to go into 70% tax rates or 80% tax rates. You just wouldn't. And I don't think anyone would really. I think it's proven around the world that doesn't work. That Laffer principle definitely comes into play. People do honestly think, well, I'm going to go and live abroad. I'm going to Portugal, become a new non-resident and have a 10%.
Half of, you know, your income that's kind of being taken away. I think that's something that probably gives people pause, isn't it? Yeah.
Definitely. I can honestly see, though, I could see the CGT change is something that, because of such a low community of people, and you could badge it with a fairness tag, couldn't you, to say it's the same as income, let's simplify it and make it taxed as income. That wouldn't satisfy the get money in, because if you doubled it, that's another 10 billion against 400, you know. So it's the income tax, CGT, and the corporate tax rate is quite easy. I mean, we've seen the digital services tax with the extra 2%, as it were, on digital services, because it's so easy to cite your business abroad, transact with the UK, you know, through, and yet the profit all flows into a low tax zone. So digital services tax does get to that point, and you see the OECD are looking to have a much more robust sort of OECD accepted means of getting the revenue from the transaction. You're doing business with the people in that country. That country's government should get some share of the tax revenue. It shouldn't all just flow into some sort of low tax zone, and you get nothing out of it. And we've got our own version of that. So I think targeted corporate tax increases could possibly happen. There was talk about that, wasn't there? You know, you should tax the supermarkets more. They've made loads out of this. They're the only ones open, and everyone's cleaned the shelves of toilet paper, so they should pay tax on that. But there's counters to that. You know, they say we haven't made as much money. So targeted corporation tax, I think he'd probably like to do a small increase to income tax, VAT, national insurance, because that gets a lot of money in. But I have to watch the economic aspects of that. CGT, more for what it looks like in terms of levelling up and fairness and being seen to be that new Conservative government that they really want to be.
Yeah. And I'll just take a final question, and this comes from Richard Blythen. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he asks, bearing in mind the autumn budget has been cancelled, is the current budget date in March too late for implementation in 21-22?
No, I think they'll certainly income tax. They'll need to, if they're going to do anything, with that, and I doubt they will, to increase it at that point. Then all of that, we used to have budgets. You know, that budget used to be in March, and that did say what the tax rates are going to be for the next year. We sometimes got an early indication of what they were likely to be by the pre-budget report. But no, I think that's definitely not too early. And certainly if there was going to be CGT change, then that could be done very easily. Actually, from that point, but we don't even know the date. We don't know the date in March yet, anyway. So no, I don't think so, because we've been there before. It's the way we used to do it.
Fine. Okay, great. I think that's about everything. Thanks for sort of hanging on for those extra questions. It's obviously kind of got people kind of engaged. So thank you ever so much for that. And we'll catch up soon, Tony. Hopefully,
brilliant.
In reality.
Don't forget TechLink, everyone. You've got access. There's bulletins every day on it if you're so minded to have a look at that sort of stuff. Thanks,
Great.
Natalie.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you to everyone at home for asking all of your questions and for your comments and for liking all the songs as well. So just to let you know, everyone who's attended today and entered their details will get an email that will ask you to complete a short feedback survey. Once that's done, you'll get your CPD certificate, a copy of Tony's slides, and you'll also get a link to the event replay in case you want to watch this back or in case you want to share it with your colleagues or elsewhere. Thanks so much for joining us.